This is discussion number 6, Working with the States. It's part of the Federalism Unit, which is chapters 3 and 4. So how does a new state get created? Well, what Congress does is that there's an area of land that people would like to have to become a state. So they petition Congress saying, please give us the opportunity to become a state. Congress will then pass what is called an enabling act. Well, they will create permission for those people to get together and draw up a state constitution. Remember that constitution does have to adhere to certain federal principles and that they have to ultimately listen to all federal law. Now, step 2 then is that if the constitution is deemed acceptable, Congress will then pass an act of admission and poof, you've got a state. Now, remember that's important for the order of reckoning, and that's why all state constitutions have to listen to federal law, because ultimately federal law allows the state constitution to exist. So, the national government must ensure that all state governments have a Republican style of government. That's not capital R with the elephant, that's little r, which means they must have a representative government. The national government is not allowed to allow, for example, New York, to have a dictatorship. They have to have elections and people put in positions correctly. The national government is to protect the states against invasion. The United States cannot say, oh, it's just Florida being invaded, we'll let them go. They are obligated to protect each state. They're also required to recognize the legal and physical existence of the states. The national government cannot go that we're going to slice a part out of Pennsylvania and we're going to give it to Ohio. This was actually quite significant. For example, the creation of West Virginia, where Virginia left the Union, but the counties that now make up West Virginia decided that they didn't want to leave, so they decided to form their own state. And so the United States, underneath the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, said that we will recognize these counties, that you are now your own state, and those are the actual boundaries. Now, so what else do we have to do with dealing with the states? Well, a lot of times the federal government does help the state governments administer different programs. For example, Medicare and Medicaid, while they were created on a national level, they are administered by the states. And a lot of time the money that goes toward paying those bills come from the federal government and are given to the states so that the states can disperse them as best seen fit. Now, we have a couple different ideas of what do we call this money? Grant and aid programs is where the government gives the money to the states. Now, they can get block grants, which means that we would like you to use this money for education. And then it's up to the states of how they use that money. Or they could give a categorical grant, which is we're going to give you this money for education and you must use it in order to hire new qualified teachers, and those teachers must be certified in their subject area, and they must have so many hours of this, and they have to do this, that, and a nice long list of requirements. That's a categorical grant. And then there's project grants. A lot of times we think of these as scientific grants to investigate this or research that, or to very specific activity. That's what a project grant is. Now, some other times, for example, if the state police arrest someone and they need help identifying them, sometimes they can get help. They'll get help from the FBI or the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Department, or other law enforcement agencies will help states in that. Another way is what's called a Lulu payment. Now, the example I'm going to give to you is Letterkenny Army Depot. That's a large piece of land in northern Franklin County. And that would be real estate taxes that could be gathered by Chambersburg School District, Shippensburg School District, and other districts that border this huge expanse of land that we call Letterkenny Army Depot. Well, it was often done that they're not getting the real estate payments. The government will give those municipalities a payment to replace what they lost. Now, Lulu payments have pretty much gone out of date. A lot of them disappeared in the late 80s. early 80s with Ronald Reagan. However, they still exist. Also, there is the arming of the National Guard units that the national government does. Also, the sharing of census information. It's in the Constitution that the United States government has to count everybody every 10 years. They don't keep that information for themselves. They actually share that information with the states. Now, while the state also helps the federal government. For example, there is only one office that is elected nationally, and that is the President of the United States. Everything else is based on states. On top of that, there is, when we're talking about the presidency, we're talking about electing local electors, not actually voting for the president. And so these national elections are done by the states, and the states do them for them. Also, the states do regulate and administer and make sure that everything's taken care of for the naturalization of people who want to become citizens of the United States. A lot of times, it'll be local police or state police who capture federal criminals or federal fugitives, and then they will wait for the federal government people to show up and take them and put them in jail. They won't say, well, you're not wanted for state law, you can go ahead and escape. They'll hold them for the federal laws. Now, there are some requirements as far as what states must do for each other. For example, if one state wants to work with another state, they have to make sure that the states are cooperating with each other and that the states that are teaming up are not increasing their political power. That's in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. And so a lot of times there will be cooperative efforts between states, like dealing with bridges, going over the rivers that form their boundaries, and stuff like that. Also, states must give full faith and credit to each other's decisions. For example, let's say that you get convicted of embezzlement in Pennsylvania, and through a quirk of fate, call it an escape from prison, you are then discovered in Virginia. Virginia cannot go, well, Pennsylvania's got stupid judicial system, we're not going to turn you over. If you are justifiably arrested, you have an arrest warrant, or you are escaped from prison, states are required to recognize that those judicial proceedings are legitimate, and therefore they have to be enforced, and then they are to give you up. One thing on there that's extremely controversial is the idea of recognizing certificates and marriage license. The Defense of Marriage Act was passed in the mid-90s, and that was to say that if your state did not recognize same-sex unions, that you did not have to recognize another state's marriage certificate saying that the same-sex people had been married. Of course, in the summer of 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government cannot deny a marriage certificate that was created by a state. They still left open a little bit there about whether states had to recognize other states' marriage certificates, but they did say the federal government did not have to recognize it. Then we have to, we already talked about extradition. If you're a fugitive from justice, one state catches you, they are required to give you up. Usually it goes to the state governor, and the governor will then say, okay, this is justifiable arrest warrant, you're going to go back to the state where you committed the crime. Also, there's a requirement to provide to all citizens the same privileges and immunities of your own state. For example, if people in Pennsylvania are allowed to go to the park, it cannot be said that people from New York are not allowed going to that park. If you're going to participate in some type of business transaction, you cannot charge different tax rates based on which state that they're from. And those ideas is what we need to be concerned about when we talk about privileges and immunities. You see there's other things listed there, and that's what and I want to make sure that you check out that list. Any questions, make sure you ask in class. Thank you. This concludes discussion number 6, working with the states. It is also the conclusion of the Federalism Unit, which is chapters 3 and 4.